This story happened what feels like a really long time ago. I was still new to my job as a paramedic and had yet to be beaten down by the stresses that come with the job. Honestly, it's a good job, but it will wear you down. Working for 12-hour shifts at some point, running around, getting consistent blasts of adrenaline because of calls, it will age you so much quicker than other jobs. I cannot tell you how many days off I slept through because I was completely and totally exhausted from my shifts. Honestly, it's enough to destroy your personal relationships, which is where we can segue into the context for this story. Back when I was a rookie paramedic, I was dating a rookie police officer named Laura. Laura was an incredibly energetic, spry, and fun-loving girl that I genuinely loved, and she was probably one of the nicest people I've met in all my years on this earth. Laura actually joined the force because her father, Paul, was a sergeant in the same department, and he'd been on the force for quite a while. I don't remember how long, but he was pretty well known and well respected throughout our small town. I actually knew Paul from when I was a medic prior to dating Laura. So when I met her and we started dating, it was actually quite the surprise for me when I found out they were related. Regardless, he knew I had a good head on my shoulders and a steady job, so he was okay with us being together. Anyways, now that you know who I am and who they are, it's probably best to get to the actual story and situation. Like most paramedic horror stories, this one isn't one that is scary per se, but it's terrifying in its own right. On the night of this situation, I had been working a full 12 shift and I was tired. I was actually scheduled to be off the next day, so I was ready for it to come to an end. The night had actually been fairly busy, considering it was the middle of the week. I think I had already been on 2 calls in the evening alone, and the other pair had already been sent out twice. And while the calls we had taken weren't that big a deal, it was a lot more than what I was used to having to deal with. Because of this, I was hopeful that we would have a silent remainder of the evening, and I would be able to do nothing for the last hour of my shift. I know this sounds lazy, but trust me, when you're running around for 5 or so hours taking care of various things around town, it's enough to make you want to sleep while driving. Of course, that's not how things work in reality, and with around 45 minutes left of an exhausting shift, we get a high priority call. I'm sitting there and listening to the dispatch inform us of the situation as we're getting everything together to get out as quickly as possible. The whole thing was a pretty horrible mess, apparently. We were informed that we were responding to a shots fired, potential injury at a domestic call. The initial call that the officers had taken was one where a woman had called police on her husband because he was drunk and had hit her. This location was actually a frequent call, one that the officers had gone to a number of times, and the situation typically ended in the husband going to jail for a couple days and getting out with a court date. But the wife would not leave him. I know that the cycle of abuse is very real, and these kinds of relationships are really hard to get out of, but it's really painful to see these kinds of things recur like this. Unfortunately, and obviously, this time had gone south. There were shots fired with injury, and obviously, we were headed in that direction as fast as we humanly could. It wasn't close, but we were still making pretty good time overall. It wasn't until we were about halfway there that the call changed from shots fired, potential injury, to shots fired, officer down. This kind of escalation turns the entire situation from a big deal to a huge deal. We now had an officer that was in need of immediate medical attention and possibly other injuries. We pulled up to the scene and we jumped out when we saw a second team of officers had already secured the scene and were trying to help out the downed officer. While I anticipated this to be a terrible situation, I could feel my heart stopping when I saw Paul on the ground in a pool of blood. I ran over to him and I started to do everything I could to stop the bleeding, but I knew immediately that there was nothing I could do. He had been shot on the left side of his neck and he was already fading at that point. I remember grabbing his hand and kneeling down and telling the officer to hold pressure. The look in his eyes when he saw me is something that will stick with me until the day I die. It was almost like a glimmer of hope. He knew me, so I think part of him had become relaxed when he saw me approaching. Either he started to think he was going to be okay, or he knew he was a goner, and at that point, he didn't feel alone. Like I said, I tried to keep him there, and we tried to get him into the ambulance while maintaining, but he passed while we were heading to the hospital. Apparently, the call had gone bad within the first few minutes of Paul showing up. The husband was, as the wife had said, drunk and pissed off at the world. When Paul showed up, he expected the whole thing to go as it had gone in the past. The husband would fight for a bit, but would eventually end up in cuffs and in the cell for a day or two. What he didn't expect was that the husband was going to be completely off it and shoot his wife dead while Paul was knocking on the door. From what I was told, this guy murdered his wife, then when he saw Paul, he shot him from the window, then turned the gun on himself. Talking to Laura was nearly impossible after this whole thing had happened, because there was nothing I could do and I had to just watch him die. I tried to talk to her about it and tell her that he wasn't in pain, and I tried to tell her that he was definitely at peace when it happened, but it didn't do much. I don't blame her for not wanting to hear all the standard statements. Laura and I split up pretty soon after. We kind of just grew distant, and I think that she didn't want to be around me anymore after this whole thing happened. Again, I don't blame her. She also quit the force within the month. I actually have no idea what happened to her after this, and I'm sure she took a lot of time to actually get in a good place mentally. I just hope that if Laura is out there, she is living her life to the best of her ability, and she was able to keep going strong, if not for herself, then for Paul. This may not be a standard babysitting horror story, but it's still worth sharing, and there are actually a few things to share, but these are some of the worst. I've been working as a lead at a daycare for almost 13 years now, and it's almost entertaining how unfiltered kids are when you get them talking, and how much they imitate those that they're around frequently. What kind of sucks about this is that when a kid does something that's iffy or questionable, we have to contact CPS by law and report what happened. One instance of this happened actually pretty recently with a little boy we'll call Jim. One day during the morning, while the kids were playing, I was making coffee and Jim walked up to me. I was putting my creamer and sugar in the mug, and Jim asked me if I liked to smell the sugar. I was a bit confused at first, why would I smell sugar? I told him that I wasn't sure what he was talking about, and he then tells me that sometimes, while he's at his uncle's house, his uncle likes to smell the sugar. I asked what he meant, and he tells me that his uncle likes to smell the sugar off the table with a straw. Come to find out, while his uncle was watching him, he decided it would be okay to do cocaine in front of him and just tell him it's sugar. Another one that's worth talking about happened with a little girl in my group named Sasha. Sasha was a sweetheart. She was incredibly quiet and soft-spoken, but she was also one of the nicest little girls I'd ever met. One day, her dad brought her in and she had a bruise on her face. Obviously, my mind went to a dark place, and I told her dad that I had to legally ask what had happened. He tells me that he didn't know. She had the bruise when he had gotten home from work the night before, and she wouldn't tell him no matter how much he asked. He seemed sincere and said that he thinks that she fell or something when she was doing something she wasn't supposed to, and she didn't want to get in trouble. I accepted his response, and we went on. Around lunch, she said she wanted to tell me something and asked if I could keep a secret. I told her I could, of course, and asked what was wrong. She told me that she was sorry that she had lied to her dad about her bruise, but she didn't want him mad because his girlfriend had given it to her. Apparently, her dad's girlfriend was verbally and now physically abusive to this little girl, and the dad was none the wiser. I, of course, told him and filled out my report to Protective Services. I felt bad for the dad, but I had no choice in the matter. The last one is probably the saddest one for me and happened when I was still fairly new to working at a daycare. There was a little boy that attended our daycare named Adam. Adam was incredibly shy, but absolutely loved being in the daycare because of how much he got to socialize. I know that sounds like opposites, but he was more like he was shy until he got to know you. Adam's father was a police officer for the city and was a fairly well-respected guy. Adam was very clearly proud of how much of a hero his dad was, and he would talk about it a lot. Then, one day, while I was sitting at one of the tables, Adam said something about, "People are coming to get him." I asked him what he meant, and he said that, "Daddy says that some of the bad people he arrested are going to come get us." I was kind of just like, okay? I said I wanted to hear more, and he goes on to say that his dad had put duct tape over his windows and put a camera in his room to watch him and make sure the bad guys didn't break in. I really didn't know what to do with this, and I probably shouldn't have, but I actually contacted his father about the situation, asking if everything was all right at home, because Adam was saying things that didn't make sense. His dad laughed and said that Adam just had a wild imagination. I agreed, said it was okay, and hung up. Unfortunately, I have no idea what happened after that, because Adam never came back to the daycare. His father had resigned, and apparently they moved away within the next week. I don't know if this was for protection or if his dad was legitimately paranoid. So yeah, kids can say some crazy things, but I just want to use this as an opportunity to say that kids do not have filters. If you tell your kids something, or if you do something in front of your kids, they will 100% repeat it, or will happily go on telling someone else all about it.